Today I'm going over this section in chapter 5 called The Ego's Use of Guilt. Perhaps some of our concepts will become clearer and more personally meaningful if the ego's use of guilt is clarified. The ego has a purpose, just as the Holy Spirit has. The ego's purpose is fear, because only the fearful can be egotistic. The ego's logic is as impeccable as that of the Holy Spirit, because your mind has the means at its disposal to side with heaven or earth as it elects. But again, remember that both are in you. So the part of us that is heaven is our truth. That's spirit. That's who we really are. And the part of us that is ego is not true. That's our split mind. That part is false. And both of those parts appear to be within us right now. The truth and the lie, heaven and earth. In heaven, there is no guilt, because the kingdom is attained through the atonement, which releases you to create. The word create is appropriate here because once what you have made is undone by the Holy Spirit, the blessed residue is restored and therefore continues in creation. Because what we appear to have done in this egoic, illusory world is not true. So once it's undone, once we remove our belief in it, it just disappears. It no longer exists. And all that really exists is love. What is truly blessed is incapable of giving rise to guilt and must give rise to joy. This makes it invulnerable to the ego because its peace is unassailable. It is invulnerable to disruption because it is whole. So he's telling us that ego can never destroy spirit. Guilt is always disruptive, meaning the ego. Yes, ego and its guilt are always disruptive. Anything that engenders fear is divisive because it obeys the laws of division, meaning the ego. The ego is all about division. If the ego is the symbol of the separation, it is also the symbol of guilt. Guilt is more than merely not of God. It is the symbol of an attack on God. Okay, that is the ego's tool. That is how it keeps us trapped in its thought system, through guilt. And it is an attack on God. Through doing that, the ego tries to say that God doesn't exist and that God's world is gone forever and that the ego is the only thing that is real. That's why it's an attack on God. This is a totally meaningless concept except to the ego, meaning attacking God. Only the ego would want to do that. But do not underestimate the power of the ego's belief in it. This is the belief from which all guilt really stems. So the only reason that the ego appears to have any power over our mind whatsoever is because we believe in it. And this is where all guilt stems from. Because when we believe in the ego's thought system, then we believe that the ego is real and that we actually destroyed God and heaven being a state of oneness, where we know that we're all one with each other and one with God. The ego believes that it destroyed that and that this false world is what is real. And therefore we feel guilty because inside of us, we know what our truth is. Unconsciously, we know our real truth. But the ego has us believing that we have sinned. And because of that belief in sin, we feel a tremendous amount of guilt. The guilt really is stemming from not necessarily the things that we think we're doing in this world that are bad and we're guilty and we need to be punished for. Those are just symbols of where the guilt is really coming from, which is our belief that we destroyed God in heaven. That once we chose to believe in the ego, that this choice in our split mind meant the instant destruction of God in heaven. That is really where all of our guilt is coming from. It's unconscious. We don't know it. And therefore, since we're all walking around with a tremendous amount of guilt, we're constantly projecting it out into our dream, into the illusion. because we can't handle the feeling of all that guilt. We want to get rid of it, so we project it out. That is the ego's world. That is this world that we appear to live in. And this is how the ego functions and keeps itself going in this world. We participate in that by giving our thoughts and our mind to the ego. The ego is the part of the mind that believes in division. That's why our mind seems to be split when we believe in the ego, because it's all about division. It's also why we appear to be many, 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 many different people and beings, because the ego believes in division. Really, there's just one of us. How could part of God detach itself without believing it is attacking him? Exactly. So this whole system that the ego believes in itself is based in attack. All of this dividing is attack. We spoke before of the authority problem as based on the concept of usurping God's power. That's what the ego does. It thinks it is usurping God's power. The ego believes that this is what you did because it believes that it is you. So when we identify with the ego, which most of us are doing most of the time, then we believe that we are guilty because we believe that we are attacking God. If you identify with the ego, you must perceive yourself as guilty, right? That's what I just said. Whenever you respond to your ego, you will experience guilt and you will fear punishment. Okay, that's how this entire world works. That's why it appears to be a shit show all the time, because that is the exact system of the ego. The ego is quite literally a fearful thought. However ridiculous the idea of attacking God may be to the sane mind, never forget that the ego is not sane. We are all insane and out of our minds when we believe that we are egos. It represents a delusional system and speaks for it, right? That's what the ego does. It speaks for its delusional system. Listening to the ego's voice means that you believe it is possible to attack God, and that a part of him has not been torn away by you. Fear of retaliation from without follows, because the severity of the guilt is so acute that it must be projected. When we identify with the ego's thought system, it is an attack on God, and then we feel really guilty. It is so acute, so strong, and so severe that we must release this guilt, and we do that by projecting it out into the world and blaming everyone else and everything out in the world for our non-peace. And that can include us. We can blame ourselves as well as something separate, as a separate ego. And therefore, we would be projecting that guilt onto us as a separate ego or other separate egos. Whatever you accept into your mind has reality for you. So he's telling us it's up to us to choose. There's only two choices, spirit or ego. We get to choose. And whichever one we choose is what our reality becomes. It is your acceptance of it that makes it real. If you enthrone the ego in your mind, your allowing it to enter makes it your reality. So if we put the ego up on a throne and say, oh, this is who I am, I know who I am ego, then we are allowing that to become our reality. But if we identify with spirit and say, I know who I am spirit, then that becomes our reality. This is because the mind is capable of creating reality or making illusions. Okay, two choices again. You can create reality, meaning being in alignment with spirit, knowing you're one with God and with everyone else, or choosing ego and making illusions. Those are our two choices. I said before that you must learn to think with God. To think with him is to think like him. This engenders joy, not guilt, because it is natural. So our natural inclination is to be loving, is to be identified with spirit. And when we allow ourselves to be our natural, loving spirit self, this is when we can experience joy. Guilt is a sure sign that your thinking is unnatural. That is his way of saying that you have identified with ego. So if you're feeling guilt, you know that you have identified with ego. It is a sure sign. Unnatural thinking will always be attended with guilt because it is the belief in sin. It's another way of saying if we identify with ego, we will experience guilt and believe we are sinners. The ego does not perceive sin as a lack of love, but as a positive act of assault. Oh my goodness. So the ego just wants to assault and defend because it believes in sin. This is necessary to the ego's survival because as soon as you regard sin as a lack, you will automatically attempt to remedy the situation because our natural state is spirit. So if we see sin as a lack, we will naturally want to remedy that with love, with identifying with spirit. So the ego doesn't want us to see sin as lack. The ego wants to see it as a way to succeed and survive in the illusory world. So he's saying that if we saw sin as a lack, we would automatically want to remedy the situation within our natural self. And then he says, and you will succeed. Because as soon as we want to identify with spirit, we will. As soon as we want to know that we are whole and we are one with one another and with God, we will. Because that is our truth. It just waits patiently for us. The ego regards this as doom, but you must learn to regard it as freedom. So the ego regards us knowing that we are whole and one with each other and one with God as doom, because that is how the ego dies. That is how the ego is undone. Jesus is telling us he wants us to see when we identify with our spirit self and knowing that we are one with God and one with one another as freedom, not as the doom that the ego sees, but as the freedom, which is our truth. The guiltless mind cannot suffer. Being sane, the mind heals the body because it has been healed. So this is how Jesus appeared to perform miracles when he was here, because he knew that the body wasn't real and he healed his mind. And when we heal our mind, our body no longer has any symbols of sickness. And even if a body appeared to have some sort of sickness in it, whether it be his own body or someone else's body, because he did not identify with that, this is how he was able to heal others, because he got their mind to join with his to see that they were just spirit, that they were Christ, that they were not their bodies. And this is how we heal. So that's one way to explain it as far as actual physical bodies within the illusion healing. But another way to look at it is that no matter what is happening with an illusory body, we are healed because we are not our bodies. And this is why when Jesus was being crucified, he felt no pain and was completely at peace because his mind was healed. So in the dream, it appeared that terrible things happened to his body, but in his mind, he knew that nothing was happening to his body because he wasn't a body. The sane mind cannot conceive of illness because it cannot conceive of attacking anyone or anything. So the sane mind would be a mind that's identified with spirit, and spirit would never attack. I said before that illness is a form of magic, right? Because we can only be ill in illusion, and magic happens within the illusion. It might be better to say that it is a form of magical solution, meaning the sane mind, meaning perceiving correctly within the illusion. Even though perceiving is of the illusion, when we perceive correctly, meaning knowing we are spirit, again and again and again, this is a magical solution to this illusory world that we have made with our split and insane mind. The ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Okay, this is why we made this universe to begin with, because we wanted to run away from God. We wanted to escape the punishment of God. And then we experienced this guilt within us, thinking that this is another way to escape the punishment of God. That's what this entire world is. That's what the ego is. It's just trying to escape the punishment of God. But in the meantime, God is not looking to punish anybody. It's all a lie. None of it is true. It's not real. This is what Jesus is trying to tell us. Yet even in this, it is arrogant. The ego is arrogant, even in thinking that it is mitigating the punishment of God. It attributes to God a punishing intent and then takes this intent as its own prerogative. So the ego makes up the lie that God is punishing, and then it says, oh, okay, well, now I'm going to punish in order to escape the punishment of God. So it makes up a lie, and then it uses that lie to attack. That probably seems very familiar to you. You probably see this happening in our world a lot, where people just make shit up, and then they use that shit that they made up to defend some terrible thing that they're doing, right? And the only reason we see this all the time in our world is because there is only one of us and we have one mind. And we're going to project the symbology of what we are doing out in the world all the time. It tries to usurp all the functions of God as it perceives them because it recognizes that only total allegiance can be trusted. So the ego tries to usurp the power of God and wants us to fully believe in it and not at all believe in God. The ego cannot oppose the laws of God any more than you can, but it can interpret them according to what it wants, just as you can. It's a polite way of saying we can make shit up all we want, but it doesn't make it true. And that's what the ego does. It just makes up a bunch of bullshit. And then we have fallen for it. And that is why this has become our reality. That is why the question, what do you want, must be answered. You are answering it every minute and every second, and each moment of decision is a judgment that is anything but ineffectual. Its effects will follow automatically until the decision is changed. So again, he's reminding us that we have two choices. Whatever we choose will become our reality. And so that's why we have to decide what we want. What do you want? Do you want the ego's world or do you want spirit's world? And we make that decision in every single now moment. That's why he's saying that we decide every second of every minute, is because we are always choosing in each now moment which teacher we want to identify with, spirit or ego. And that's why we have to ask ourselves, what do you want? Because most of the time we're never asking ourselves that question. We just assume that we are egos, and we just assume that this world is real, and we just assume all of the things that the ego wants us to believe, and that's why we're not at peace. So he's teaching us about this other choice that we have. We can choose truth. We can choose love. We can choose wholeness. We can choose innocence. And when we make that choice, we are reinforcing that as our reality. And then when we include others in that reality by quote unquote forgiving them, meaning knowing that they're not really there and that they're all the innocent child of God. And when we do that, we are continuing to reinforce our reality, which is spirit, which is love, which is wholeness. He's telling us that we have to ask ourselves, we have to be thinking, what do I want? What am I going to choose? That is a huge part of waking up, is knowing that you have a choice and knowing that you're making a choice in every now moment. It's simply the awareness of it that's half the issue. Remember, though, that the alternatives themselves are unalterable. The Holy Spirit, like the ego, is a decision. Okay, we have to decide to choose it. Together, they constitute all the alternatives the mind can accept and obey. Okay, that means whichever teacher we choose will create our reality. What is our mind going to accept and obey? Is it going to accept and obey ego, or is it going to accept and obey spirit? That's up to us. The Holy Spirit and the ego are the only choices open to you. They're the only two choices. God created one, and so you cannot eradicate it. So he's saying that the truth was created by God and we can never eradicate it. It cannot go away. We cannot destroy it. You made the other, meaning ego, and so you can, meaning we can eradicate the ego. We can never eradicate spirit, but we can eradicate ego because we made it. It's not even real. Only what God creates is irreversible and unchangeable. Okay, that's why only spirit is true. Only love is real. That's why, because it's what God created. What you made, meaning the ego and the illusory world, can always be changed. Because when you do not think like God, you are not really thinking at all. It's why he's always telling us that we are insane when we are identified with ego. We are out of our mind. We cannot think at all. The only real thoughts that exist are thoughts with God, which means love, unconditional, innocent love for every child of God. Delusional ideas are not real thoughts, although you can believe in them, but you are wrong, he says. The function of thought comes from God and is in God. As part of his thought, you cannot think apart from him. It's not possible. We are one with God. We cannot think apart from him. We can block it out. We can deny it. We can pretend it doesn't exist. But when we are truly thinking, we can only think with God, and we cannot be apart from him. Irrational thought is disordered thought. God himself orders your thought because your thought was created by him. Guilt feelings are always a sign that you do not know this. So again, he's telling us as soon as we feel any kind of guilt, it means that we are thinking with the wrong teacher. We forgot to know our truth. They always show that you believe you can think apart from God and want to. Right? That's what the ego does. It wants to believe that it usurped God's power. It can think apart from God, and it wants to think apart from God. Every disordered thought is attended by guilt at its inception and maintained by guilt in its continuance. So it is the basis of the ego thought system is this guilt. It's what the entire ego thought system is based in, feeling guilty about the destruction of God, which isn't even true. And so that's why as soon as we have a disordered thought, meaning identifying with ego, right away, guilt is there. It is there at its inception. And then it continues on because as long as we continue believing these false ego thoughts, that guilt will continue on. Guilt is inescapable by those who believe they order their own thoughts, meaning ego, and must therefore obey their dictates, meaning the ego's dictates. This makes them feel responsible for their errors without recognizing that by accepting this responsibility, they are reacting irresponsibly. So he's saying that when we accept responsibility, like, oh, I'm a sinner, I'm guilty, or oh, these other people are sinners and guilty, that is irresponsible of us to accept the responsibility of guilt, if that makes sense. It's a little bit of a riddle. Meaning, don't fall for the trick of feeling guilty because you're believing the ego's lies. By believing the ego's lies, we are being irresponsible. If the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself, and I assure you that it is, he says, then the responsibility for what is atoned for cannot be yours. Okay? It's Spirit's responsibility to do all of this, and all we have to do is identify with Spirit to have Spirit take care of it. That is how we do our miracle worker job. It's by practicing forgiveness and handing it over to Spirit. Okay, so he's assuring us that it is our job to accept the atonement. Then the responsibility for what is atoned for cannot be yours. So again, we just want to give it to Spirit. We don't need to worry about the details. We don't need to define every single thing that we think we've done wrong or other people have done wrong. No, we just need to give it all over to Holy Spirit, knowing that none of it is real. To just give our mind over to Spirit, to be cleansed, to be purified. Spirit will take care of it for us. The dilemma cannot be resolved except by accepting the solution of undoing. We have to accept Spirit's offer to undo the ego, otherwise it never gets undone. You would be responsible for the effects of all your wrong thinking if it could not be undone. So he's saying that if Spirit didn't exist and the ego was real, then we would be responsible for the effects of all of our wrongdoing. But that's not true. It's not true. The purpose of the atonement is to save the past in purified form only. If you accept the remedy for disordered thought, a remedy whose efficacy is beyond doubt, how can its symptoms remain? So once we give our mind to spirit, it will purify everything and none of those symptoms will remain. The continuing decision to remain separated is the only possible reason for continuing guilt feelings. Another way of saying continuing to identify with the ego's thought system. That's a decision that we are making when we do that, to remain separated and to remain feeling guilty. It's a decision that we make. We have said this before, but did not emphasize the destructive results of the decision. Any decision of the mind will affect both behavior and experience. Okay, so I've said this many times, and I love that he has this line here to emphasize this. The decision of our mind will affect our behavior and our experience. So we do not want to walk around this illusion thinking, I have to act a certain way. I have to act kind. I have to act loving. I have to do certain things to demonstrate this love. No, that's still all coming from an ego perspective. It is not about your behavior. This world isn't even really here. You're not even really here. It's not about that. It's about, he calls it here, your decision. The decision means which teacher are you deciding to identify with. So when you do decide to identify with spirit, you don't need to worry about your behavior or your experience of the world, because it will feel loving and peaceful because you have chosen Holy Spirit as your teacher and as your guide. So you will naturally have behaviors that will appear loving. And we don't need to worry about the ego perspective of what appears to be loving. Sometimes a loving thing for ourselves can be putting up a boundary with another ego that is continuously appearing to attack us. Holy Spirit can easily guide us in a situation like that to keep a distance from that person within our illusion, but at the same time in our mind, forgiving that person. So it's not about your behavior. You don't have to go be super loving to that person and keep putting yourself in the presence of this person. I'm just using this as an example, to act unkindly towards you and project guilt onto you and then attack you. You don't need to put yourself in that situation and then act all loving towards that person to prove that you're aligned with spirit. That's all backwards and wrong. That is someone who is aligned with ego, who's trying to prove something through their behavior. What he's saying here is, when you choose spirit as your guide, whatever behaviors come out of you will be loving, because spirit will guide you to do it. And I'm using the example of putting up a boundary with someone because the world and ego could easily say, well, that's not loving. You're, not talking to that person, or, you have boundaries with that person. But that's not true. Those boundaries can easily be loving, depending upon the situation. And so we can't decide that. We in our ego framework cannot decide that, but spirit can. So when we are aligned with spirit, we will feel guided by spirit within us. Our instincts will tell us to do certain things. Our intuition will tell us to do certain things when we are aligned with spirit. And sometimes that will be to have a boundary with certain people while forgiving them in our mind. So identifying with spirit will determine what your behavior will be and what your experience of your dream world will be. It's not something that you could define or identify within the ego's thought system, the way we're used to thinking of things. It's not about that. It's the concept of being aligned with spirit. And then spirit will always tell you what to say, what to do, where to go. And that will always be the right thing for you in your dream, for you to wake up. What you want, you expect. This is not delusional. Your mind does make your future, and it will turn it back to full creation at any minute if it accepts the atonement first. It will also return to full creation the instant it has done so. Having given up its distorted thought, the proper ordering of thought becomes quite apparent. So what we want, we expect. If we want to believe we are an ego and that we need to defend ourselves and attack, then that is what we will get. That will be our reality. But if we believe that we are spirit and that we are not bodies and we are not egos and that we are one with God and one another and we are all the innocent child of God, we will have a completely different experience. And as we continue to practice that again and again and again, this illusory world will seem to disappear. First, it will seem to disappear in importance to us. We will no longer take it all that seriously. We will remember to laugh, as he tells us in the Course. We simply forgot to laugh. That's how we came up with this whole crazy dream that we appeared to be trapped in this whole time. But it's already undone. We've already awakened. The dream is over. It happened like that, and we are just reviewing it mentally over eons. It's already done. The script is already written. The whole world already happened and then awakened. So all we need to do is relax into spirit, to just release the entire thought system and script of the ego. Don't play that part anymore. Don't participate in that play. Choose spirit instead. Keep reminding yourself every day. Keep remembering to practice forgiveness every time you can. And slowly, over illusory time, you will appear to awaken to the point where you are no longer identified with the world. And then you will no longer need to participate. And then you will be awakened and be home, just like Jesus did. And that is what he is teaching us in this course.